Hello, and welcome to the 2020 National Science Policy Symposium and to this panel discussion titled Public Trust and Racial Justice, a Two-Way Street. My name is Meredith Schmale, and I am one of the moderators of this panel, along with my co-moderator, Maybelle Terminal. We're excited to discuss the intersection between science communication and racial justice over the next hour. Before we start, we have a few logistical notes. First, we would like to extend a big thank you to the Kavli Foundation for supporting this panel discussion and the symposium at large. The Kavli Foundation's mission is to advance science for the benefit of humanity, promoting public understanding of scientific research, and supporting scientists and their work. We are pleased to have the Kavli Foundation joining us today and look forward to future collaborations as we work together to advance racial justice, access to science policy information, and trust between scientists and the public. In a moment, I'll introduce our speakers, after which we'll hear a short presentation from each speaker. Following those presentations, my co-moderator Maybelle will ask a few questions that we've prepared in advance before we open the floor for audience questions. We intend to leave as much time for audience Q&A as possible, so please leave your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. So without further ado, I'll now introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Carrie Funk. Dr. Funk is the Director of Science and Society Research at Pew Research Center, where she leads the center's efforts to understand the implications of science for society. She has authored reports focused on public trust in science, scientific experts, and science news and information. Dr. Funk has broad experience in public opinion research and has specialized in public understanding of science topics for nearly 2 decades. She holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of California, Los Angeles. Next, we have Dr. Antator Hinton, who is an academic and career development instructor and postdoctoral fellow in endocrinology at the University of Iowa. In 2021, he will be starting as an assistant professor of molecular physiology and biophysics at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Hinton is an advocate for diversity and career development among students and has been recognized by Forbes magazine as one of the 100 Black culture makers and thought leaders. He holds a PhD in integrative molecular and biomedical sciences from Baylor College of Medicine. And finally, we have Dr. Monica Filiu Moher, who is the Director of Communications and Science Outreach at Ciencia Puerto Rico and the Associate Director of Diversity and Communication Training at iBiology. For the past 14 years, Dr. Filiu Moher has led multiple science communication efforts, from publishing a book to producing short films, to training scientists in culturally relevant science communication. She holds a PhD in neurobiology from Harvard University. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And with that, we'll move into our short presentations from each of our panelists. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Funk to get us started.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to share with you what we're seeing in Pew Research Center surveys around public trust and opinion connected with science. You know, as professional as these meetings are, home videos are not always perfect. So the tech team may hear a little extra noise around my home. I'm very hopeful that that will go away shortly. And that is just the reality of our current lives, isn't it? Listen, I'm going to talk to you about our public opinion data. And one thing I want to start with is just to remind you that when I'm talking about our data, I'm usually trying to give a voice to majority opinion. And, you know, we're looking at majority opinion from these nationally representative surveys, and that's a really useful framework. But no matter what we do, we're always omitting all of that individual variation. There's none of us who actually has views that are completely aligned with the majority American. And in particular today, I want to share with you these longstanding differences that we're seeing across racial and ethnic groups in the US. So I don't have that lived experience of a Black American or Hispanic American, but I'm going to try to point you to what we're hearing from these representative surveys of people who do. Now, I thought you might be interested, since language really matters when you're talking about social groups. One of the ways the center looks at this is we're trying to use the most common terms and the most preferred terms for a group, and that changes over time. What we do right now is we're generally referencing Black Americans. And then when it comes to Hispanics, we also use Latino interchangeably. But when we're doing surveys like our national surveys of Latinos, we actually ask people, what do you prefer? And then we customize the language in the survey based on that response. And it turns out that a lot of people don't have a preference. There are several terms that they think are okay, but that's how we handle it. Now, I want to talk to you today about trust in scientists, just to think a little bit more about what this issue is, why it matters, and how do we get at it. And, I think when I winnow it down, what is trust? I winnow down to a definition of trust that has to do with an expectation for the future. A lot of times people think of it like a relationship. If you were thinking about interpersonal trust between two people, then you extend that concept to two groups. And in this case, you're thinking about a trust between the general public, a very large group, and scientists, also a very large and disparate group. So that's the important word, is thinking about it as expectations for the future. And then the question is, where do those expectations come from? And obviously one source is going to be past experience. There might be other kinds of sources we can talk about, but one is going to be your history between the groups. And when we look at measuring public trust, we're often asking trust to do what? Trust in what way? So we usually are framing that question with something else to it. We don't just say, how much do you trust? We often are saying it for a particular purpose. So I'm going to show you, I actually will show you our data and show you how we do one of our kind of core measures. And I am going to share a screen for this purpose, and hopefully that is working. And one more button, and then I can concentrate. That worked, yeah. So this is the language at the top, is one of our core measures of trust in scientists. And so it's asking people how much confidence you have in scientists to act in the best interest of the public. And so that's how we look at it. But one of the important things we do is we are often comparing trust in scientists with trust in other groups and institutions. And that really helps us understand whether these are high or low figures. So I can't get into everything today, but that's the general idea. What I want you to notice here is how trust is differing across these three groups. And in particular, you see that Black Americans stand out for generally lower levels of trust. And when I talk about this, I'm often zoomed in on this darker blue category called great deal. So you get 4 choices: great deal of confidence, fair amount of confidence, not too much, no confidence at all. So that great deal of confidence, that's that kind of strongest, highest level of trust. And you see that it tends to be lower, particularly among Black Americans compared with white Americans. Most recently, this would be, most recently you see that Hispanic Americans looking similar to whites, but actually over time you've seen some variation there as well. So that's the key takeaway that I want you to pay attention to, because it's a long-standing difference. This is 4 years. We also have analyzed the only other data out there that's a long time frame. We see the exact same pattern. And it's something that I think we haven't been paying enough attention to. Now, if I did this correctly, yes, yay. I want to turn our minds to issues around the coronavirus and other ways in which there are racial group differences. It might take me just a half a second to get there. One of the reasons we're worried about trust is because really it's a summary metric that people think will tell us something about other kinds of attitudes and maybe even behaviors. So that takes us to kind of the worry of the moment in the scientific community, which is about whether people will be immunized for a coronavirus vaccine when it becomes available. Now, here's what we did and here's what we found. So, at this point, there is no coronavirus vaccine in the US. So you have to ask people, what do you intend to do? What do you think you'll do if one becomes available? And that's what we did here. We asked people, do you think you would get a COVID-19 vaccine if it were available today? And the share of people who said that they would, either definitely or probably would get the vaccine, went down from roughly, for Americans overall, roughly 72% in early May. And it went down to 52%, if I remember my exact numbers correctly, in September. And that drop was actually across the board. And what you're seeing here in these lines is that The intent to get the vaccine dropped, across gender, race, ethnicity, age, education lines. It also dropped roughly evenly across Democrats and Republicans, and that's concerning here. But what I want to highlight for this discussion is this second panel around racial ethnic differences. So what you're seeing there, in particular, the lowest line there is among Black Americans. You see it went from 54% who said they definitely or probably would get a COVID-19 vaccine to 32% in September. That can be a pretty shocking number. That means that a majority of Black Americans said that they would definitely or probably not get a COVID-19 vaccine. So that's a surprising number. It's a concerning number for the broader community. But I don't want to overdo that, because this is a measure of intention, and it's intention to get something that doesn't even exist yet. That's not quite the same as doing it. Public opinion is definitely still fluid at this moment. This survey was done before the Pfizer announcement. There's lots of things going on, and we're going to keep looking at how opinion is evolving in this case. But I think it remains concerning. And one of the reasons why it's concerning is that the patterns is what we're paying attention to, not the exact numbers. And these patterns in terms of differences by especially lower levels of intent among Blacks, that's consistent with longer standing differences in previous center surveys about perceptions of the benefits and risks of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. And it's consistent with government records of differences by race and ethnicity in immunization rates for the flu vaccine and other kinds of vaccines. So I think these data are just, they're just an example really of important differences among Americans, and they're raising questions for this panel about how much scientists have earned the trust of Black and Hispanic communities and what can be done to bridge these differences. Now, I know we have a kind of far-ranging conversation teed up today. And before I close out, I know we're going to be thinking about ways to boost trust in science and scientists. So one of the hurdles, so I know one thing we're going to talk about, because one of the hurdles to building those bridges that really has to do with what we might politely call the limited diversity of the STEM workforce. And what that poses a challenge for us when you're looking for more trusted voices to connect scientists and the public. If you have this level of underrepresentation in the STEM workforce, that's going to be a challenge. So a few years ago, we did a representative survey of people who have jobs in STEM, defined very broadly. And one of the things we asked them is, what's your view of how we could increase diversity in STEM? And this is just some of their verbatim comments. If I'm summarizing, what I hear a lot in those comments is this idea of starting early. Being visible is just so important to help and to kind of just to encourage others to join along, and then obviously in other ways as well as those careers develop. So I don't want to belabor it, and I want to make sure other people get time to talk. So just want to leave you with my contact information. At the center, we're doing more along these lines. We're very eager to better understand what's going on in these kinds of differences that I talked about. So I'm looking to connect with people who have an interest and expertise in these areas, and here are a couple ways that you can get in touch with me. So and with that, let me pass it over to our next speaker.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. So to follow up on trust, we'll actually be talking about why we're actually not machines today, and also talking about how to integrate policy and then actually communicating that to the public, and then how we can increase diversity in science. So of course, my name is Dr. Hinton, but for questions, call me AJ. Let's get personal. So we're not machines. And the reason I say this is because of a quote that Victoria McGovern said, who's actually at the Bureau's Wellcome Fund. And she says, we're not machines, we're human beings. And in fact, a lot of times we actually forget that we're human beings because of the work that we have to do from day-to-day practices. Another very interesting quote that was from the Dalai Lama, he said, humans are not machines, we are something more. We have to have feeling, we have to have experiences, we have to have comfort, we have to be satisfied, and that takes human direction and human behavior and affection to have this. So if we're going to actually reclaim our time and put humanity back into things instead of acting like machines, what does that look like? Well, it actually means that maybe we have to start believing in ourselves. Moral character is a very good component of measuring how diversity works and how we actually can align specific interests and network with other individuals to make these goals happen. But also we have to never forget that, are we actually controlling ourselves, or is humanity controlling us at large based upon certain ideas? So I want to propose a question to you. Why put trust back into the public if we're not familiar with the strategies that scientists use? And then also, why put trust in the public when we ourselves are still trying to understand boundaries? Well, let's take a closer look at both of these. Another famous quote by Dr. Yolo, who is actually an American Nobel Prize winner, when she actually won the Nobel Prize for a radioimmunoassay technique, which is basically developing a way to label things in blood and actually measure how much there is of that in that particular substrate or molecule in the blood. So what's very fascinating is that she pushed all the time. One of her interviews talked about her mother and talking about she never kind of felt like it was a choice. She just felt it was her passion and her direction. And so sometimes we have a struggle with inside of ourselves. I like to call it Mortal Kombat. A lot of us are trying to figure out what it is that makes us unique, but also trying to fit into the crowd, also trying to fit into a team. Well, we have to think about humanity as one big team. Having the morale of common interest is the best way that we can continue to push forward. So even with Mortal Kombat, you have to have a choice, either Mortal Kombat 1 or Mortal Kombat 2. A lot of people think Mortal Kombat 2 is not as good as Mortal Kombat 1 from the people that I surveyed. It's not everyone, but maybe the truth lies in this movie that we call Mortal Kombat. Since we're actually talking about humans and characteristics of how we actually perform and do different things, I think it's appropriate to find the truths inside of this movie. Well, one interesting quote that came from this movie, which I'll use throughout the talk, is Liu Kang's grandfather. He said, "Spare me. Spare him, my Lord Raiden. American life has enfeebled his mind. Too much television." So is it social media and the media that has to change, or is it us that has to change? When I said reclaiming your time, it's not enough. We have to repurpose your next time and then the next after that. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times we repurpose our time in the next thought to post on social media or the influence of what the television says. But have we taken a step back to actually fact check everything? This is what the curiosity of scientists actually possess. With their curiosity, they not only possess this, but also the scientific method. And with keeping the scientific method, it's important to realize that trust is an important component of that. How do we actually communicate with the public as a scientist if we're not willing to trust the data, if we're not willing to actually trust what the television is saying, which it can be very challenging, right? We have to develop skill sets so that we actually learn to bridge the gap and actually clarify what is being said that's truthful and what is not, or what may be suggestions about a report that needs to actually stand the test of time. Well, in this particular movie, again, Mortal Kombat, Sonya Blade said, "I only trust one person, Jax," and you're talking to her. So she has a partner, Jax, that they go around and do different activities in the movie to protect people, humanity, but she can't even trust her partner. So how is she able to trust her colleagues, her family, or her church? You know, for that matter, or any other organization. We have to develop trust not only in science, but also people. So I'm approaching this topic in two ways. One, talking about how humanity has to align themselves with understanding who they are. And then after they understand who they are and what they want to be about, then they can tackle the subject of diversity. But when you actually have trust, you're able to develop key ingredients that can build a fortress or build an empire. We have to think it together as a collective and also separate individuality. But with having individuality, we have to weave a web. When we actually have a web, you think of it more like a spider. A spider is an individual that actually is able to keep its prey inside of its web, move around and do other things. But what's interesting about the web that we weave, it can be dangerous. Public trust is like a spider. It goes in one direction one way, but when something happens to the elements that actually pushes the web to fall apart in one direction, and there's repair that happens, we lose trust. And a lot of times, certain communities lose trust in science because of the things that have happened in the past. So how do we actually gain trust in the community again so that the spider, humanity, can move around freely, actually understand the differences of each individual that you see here in the image, but also make a collective to understand what is going on for the bigger picture and how we can actually work together. So what's interesting is we have to go back to the Mortal Kombat movie. Well, now it's time to talk about diversity. Who knew a movie could actually develop diversity and science policy all into one, and truths? Well, Johnny Cage once said, we got a guy that has things coming out of his hands. We have another guy that's freezing stuff, and we have another guy that's actually has electricity coming out of his hands. How do we disappear? I mean, this is crazy. What is going on? Here is kind of like a little ad lib of to what I could actually see in Johnny Cage's mind, as well as in his hands and his actions. And he says, who is this guy? A lot of times we actually are not afraid to use, well, them or us or this or that or those people. But in fact, when we're thinking about diversity, we have to think about all people. So what's very important is also what Raiden said. I've looked into their souls and yours, and one of you, three will determine the outcome of the tournament. The fate of billions depends upon you. And then he laughs and he says, sorry. And the reason that this is so powerful is that a lot of times we forget that within diversity, it actually leads to a better product. There is a PNS paper that was published recently in 2020 that describes how diversity of thought and having more diverse individuals in science arms the workforce to solve problems better. So if we actually had more minorities in science, then just maybe we actually would have the cures to cancer a lot faster. Even just now, you know, Dr. Corbett is someone that a lot of people don't know, but she's actually one of the main researchers that's actually leading a team to actually study COVID-19. But nobody really knows that. And a lot of people don't even know that Peter Hotez is the leading expert at Baylor College of Medicine that actually is pushing forward for some of these policies to actually have better concerns about what's going on when it leads to certain diseases. Well, we have to think about what choices we have to make. And as we start to wrap up, you have to think about Mortal Kombat. There are 3 articles that I recently published that were commentaries in scientific journals, and they were put up under peer review, but it talks about certain issues within science that are very important. One being the power of saying no. How can the public have an interest in us if we don't know how to say no to certain things? We as humans have to be able to say no to things that are too high pressure situations, because a lot of times if we don't balance out what we really need, which is our mental health, to make the most informed decision. If we want to be able to do our jobs most effectively, we have to think about the humanity of how we move in the web. Humanity has to move in a way that doesn't hurt each other's ability to actually crawl in the web, move around, and actually join and catch prey and actually perform a piece of work. That relies on actually having mentorship. Another paper I published was specifically targeting how mentors and allies of all types can actually help minorities to be able to train more closely in the workforce. And it involves actually looking to dive deeper into different certain isms that are based in science and outside of the umbrella of sciences, so that we have to figure out how to bridge the gap. That starts with cultural competence and engaging other people to have unbiased support around all minorities that are able to do science, and also the majority. And then also having replication of this data. But we have to have the bodies to be able to put forth this work that I'm describing. It's one thing to have a bunch of mentors that are willing to train, but don't know how to actually keep minorities in science. This third paper that I talked about was actually talking about representation. The STEM pipeline is broken in some ways, or leaky as we like to call it, because there are some minorities that get through, such as myself. But there are other minorities that fall at each stage, whether it's at the undergraduate, post-bac, doctorate, postdoc, or the faculty stage, because they don't have the key mentors to continue to plug them back into the system with the other arrows. As you can see, they're going back into the system. You have to have reinforcement steps, and that comes from community engagement. Community engagement is often thought of as something that could be cumbersome and that you don't want to do it. a lot of scientists actually lack the ability to communicate effectively to the public. And this is why there's a misstep between what is science and how the science perceived in the community, and then how the community perceives science. And so there has to be a lot of healing that's done. And the humanity of the piece of everything with healing has to start with actually community engagement. One way that I started to do community engagement is actually partnering with Cell Mentor, which is one of the subsidiaries of Cell. And we're actually putting together lists that describe different African-American scientists or Black scientists across America. This list got a lot of attention, and it got around 8,200 likes. And it was very imperative that we talked about different scientists that are all across the country that are doing very specific things. And one of these particular scientists, Neil Hanchard, he's actually looking at the entire human genome. But a lot of times we don't realize that Black scientists are leading things in the way of science in general, but also specific tasks. And a lot of times we don't realize that other people are actually doing the work that we're actually talking about, but don't get the attention, such as Berunda Montgomery, who I look up to a lot, who's actually the leading expert on all things minority in the context of actually integrating in STEM. And we also, again, my committee that I work with called the Community of Scholars did this again, and we developed a more comprehensive 100 scientist list that was called 100 More Scientists, and it got 12,000 likes. Now imagine if each one of these people retweeted this one time, and then they retweeted the next tweet that was posted about something else. And then everyone started talking about this. Well, in fact, we're doing a 1,000 Black scientists list to educate social media about Black scientists. And in the meantime, we recently published and partnered with someone also in the Community of Scholars, Dr. Christina Termini, to be able to engage in the Hispanic community where I'm not able to reach as effectively. And she was able to create a 100 inspiring list as well. And so with this being said, it requires scientists to be able to be open and be able to actually push forward their ideas in a way that the community can understand. Creating a list and having someone be able to click on a website is able to reach not only the people that like the post, but the people that necessarily didn't like the post, but it plants a seed inside of their mind for community engagement. As we start to close these last 3 slides, I wanted to talk about David Asai. David Asai has started to actually use community engagement in a way that is amazing. Now, who is David Asai? He's the leading STEM education researcher and community engager in the country as far as what science considers. He works at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and he wrote an article about race matters. And he talks about how racially minoritized individuals do not want to be defined as their individual groups. He talks about how we should all be considered peers, meaning that we all should work together in science and just be thought of as Americans here in America. There's a lot of work that has to be done. We're often focused on race and not focused on the individual person and how that can better science. It's important to bring about that there are underrepresented groups in science, but we also have to think about the individual experiences that bring up the thoughts that individuals have. And what I also find very fascinating is that we still have a problem with funding in science, specifically African Americans. Race, ethnicity, and NIH research dollars matter. And if we don't have the community engaging in how minorities think differently than others, then it means that the funding that they're interested in targeting for their research program is less likely to be funded than their white counterparts. This is just one example of many. And this was published in one of the big 3 journals called CNS, Cell, Nature, and Science. And so this topic is still being talked about today. This was so long ago, you know, and there's other articles before this. We have to draw attention and have community engagement right away. So how do we do that? This is the solution. I provided some solutions in the context of reading for those who like reading, but then there's the context of people that like to do activism and actually do work. And one of those ways is to establish trust by reaching the next generation. A lot of times I partner with some individuals and we actually go around the country and do different talks. This particular school is in North Carolina, and we actually partnered together to do a DNA isolation experiment, and then we did a series with them. And this classroom is actually majority, and what's interesting about this is that they engage with us just like any other scientists. And this is what has to happen. We have to be able to work together to establish trust in each other and show how science is isolating certain DNA, how it's isolating RNA or protein, and using that to create studies that are going to benefit the public. And in addition, not only reaching high schools is important, but also reaching minorities that are actually at the very young age and interesting in them in science. We actually were able to pull this data together, and we asked them surveys, and we asked both groups, and we're able to see that during pre-questions, they weren't sure that this presentation was going to be effective because they thought maybe based upon the bias of looking at us and not knowing what we may have or what degrees we hold or what from what institutions. But after the presentation, you could clearly see that there was a significant change and that they found that the presentation was very informative. And then they also realized that their networking skills were actually increasing because they were seeing people that they normally didn't think of. And some people were actually offered internships. And additionally, we also took some other surveys and we found that, that just talking to them creates a support team where they understand science better and they understand each other. And also it allowed for them to realize that, man, I really don't know so much about this professional, program thing to go to medical school or grad school. They didn't really know what it was. But after talking to us, because we do a career development segment and a career day when we do these actual science outreach projects, they were more well-informed about their decision-making at even the middle school stage, in addition to the high school stage. And we do this every year, and we see their growth, and we do different experiments, and we try to implement this. And we're writing this up, and we're actually going to pitch this as an article that demonstrates how you can engage the community, but keep them interested in the next step along their careers. And if just one person is reached for STEM education or for a scientific career, I've done my job. And that's what we have to think about. You only have to reach one person at a time. You don't have to reach everyone. Take your breath, relax, and enjoy who you are, but also celebrate that diversity may be the key in unlocking the future. We don't know what pandemic may hit next, but we have to develop trust in each other, and especially scientists. And that starts with the community outreach. Thanks for your time.
Hi, everyone. My name is Monica Felio-Moher. Thank you so much to NSPN for having me. I'm not going to share any slides. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about my work with Ciencia Puerto Rico, particularly as it comes to culturally relevant science communication and how that can be a tool to build trust with marginalized communities. What I'm going to talk about today is really framed from my perspective as a science communication practitioner. I'm a scientist by training, but I've been practicing science communication for a long time. And so what I'm going to share today is really informed by my work and my experiences. And one of the first things that I wanted to share was, I think one of the most transformative things that I learned early on in my career as a science communicator, and it's that data is never enough. Facts are never enough. People's culture, their life experiences, their values, their identities, all of these things, they influence how people value, how they understand, and how they act upon science. And so it's really, really important that we take into account who our audiences are, like who they are as a whole, but also what's their history with science? What are their past experiences with science? And how does that affect their trust in science and scientists, but also how they engage with science and with us as scientists? And so my work is really focused around the idea of culture and identity and connecting those two things with science. And I'd say, in thinking about how to use science communication to build trust and to engage marginalized communities, there are three main things that I want to share with you today. The first thing that I do is I connect scientists of color, predominantly Puerto Rican scientists, with a wide range of media opportunities to increase their visibility and also to increase their reach. And by wide range of media opportunities, I'm talking about articles in science articles and op-eds in newspapers, both print and digital, connecting them with TV, radio, written press interview opportunities, podcasts, that kind of thing, but also producing videos, writing and editing books. And along, giving the scientists the opportunities, the platform, creating the spaces and the opportunities for them to be more visible, to be a public voice. I also focus on preparing them to be able to do this type of science communication and engagement. We know that communicating with scientists and communicating with each other is very different than communicating with different types of non-expert publics, because, and I say publics because there is no such thing as the general public. The general public it doesn't exist. It's actually a very heterogeneous group of people, and that's something that we have to keep in mind as we're communicating. And so my work focuses on giving scientists not just the spaces, but also the skills to communicate effectively and in culturally relevant ways with these predominantly marginalized communities. And then the last thing is through media opportunities and through these trainings, then I bring together scientists and communities of color and marginalized communities, again, mainly Puerto Ricans, but also marginalized communities within Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is not just one thing. It's not homogeneous. And so, combining these three things, I try to address a variety of things, giving people more information about science, the science that's happening in Puerto Rico, how science is relevant to their lives, but also trying to address some of these issues of trust. Puerto Ricans, like many other communities of color, have been abused and harmed by science. If you think about the first clinical trials that were done for the pill, they were not the clinical trials that we have today. About a third of women in Puerto Rico were sterilized without their knowledge. They were given the pill without their knowledge. There is also the case of the islands of Vieques and Culebra, which are two island municipalities of the main island of Puerto Rico, who for decades were used as practice ranges, live practice ranges by the US Navy, and that caused a variety of health issues in these populations. And so there is a high level of mistrust in science, and that those injustices that Puerto Ricans have faced historically when it comes to science obviously are tightly connected to race and to who we are, and also to the colonial relationship that Puerto Rico has with the United States. And so one of the things, we see a lot of mistrust. We hear a lot of mistrust when we're engaging with communities. And just to give you an example, recently I hosted a community forum where it was a listening session with different communities in Puerto Rico, and people are very concerned about COVID-19 and for example, the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine. There were a lot of questions about, are they experimenting on people? When is the vaccine going to come to Puerto Rico? Are they going to experiment on us? And so this mistrust in science, it's constantly manifesting, it's constantly evolving, but it's ever present in the audiences that I work with. And as I said, one of the things that my work does, and that Ciencia Puerto Rico in general we do, is we tap into culture and identity and connect it with science. We try to connect whatever the concepts or the ideas that we are conveying to our audiences to popular culture. We not only our communication it's mostly in Spanish, but it's not just in Spanish. It uses daily language, the way that people talk. and you know, as you're thinking about as a scientist or wherever spaces that you're occupying, there are a few lessons that I wanted to share in terms of, you know, how do you use communication in to engage marginalized communities, to engage communities that mistrust science, and does that extend into policymaking, for example. The first lesson is, you know, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And this is one of my favorite quotes, and it's a quote from Arthur Ashe, who was a Black American tennis player. And basically, you know, it means like, think about what are the privileges that you have, what are the spaces that you occupy, what are the connections that you have with people, and start there. You know, you can start by like having conversations with loved ones, by you know, trying to understand where people are coming from. That's something that's really, really important when it comes to mistrust about science. Is often people is not they're not necessarily against science. They have concerns. They are fearful. And so try to understand, where is it that people are coming from? You know, what's underneath this mistrust that they have, and you know, how can you try to address it? And then the third thing is finding common ground. You know, finding common ground, it could be a cultural common ground. You know, if you are a member of that community that you're trying to engage with, use that knowledge that you have about that community, about the cultural nuances of that community, to talk to them about science. And especially if you are a scientist, you know, share your own experiences as a scientist in science, how you think about these things. But it's really about having a conversation, right? It's a two-way street. And I would encourage you to think about, you know, how does your own culture, does your own identity, how does that intersect with the type of engagement that you want to do? And how does that give you common ground with the communities that you're speaking with, so that you can start you know, knocking down some barriers and addressing some of the mistrust that they have. So with that, I'll shut up, and I look forward to our conversation.
Okay, well, first of all, I just want to thank our excellent group of panelists for their time and their insightful presentations. And with a little time we have, I will be picking up some questions that we received from our audience to hear what our panelists think about. So, Monica, you mentioned that people sometimes don't trust scientists because of their history about unethical experiments. That makes it hard to trust the scientific community. There are health disparities in terms of how the pandemic has impacted different minority communities. Can you tell us what role do you think these health disparities will play in public trust and engagement in science in the future?
That's a great question. I mean, if anything, it's possible that they might decrease trust in science, or you know, that they decrease trust in how governments are using science to address the pandemic and to help certain communities. You know, one thing that we have seen in Puerto Rico is there's been so many missteps, particularly on behalf of the government, and how they've mishandled the pandemic, because I can't even say that they've handled it. And you know, I think that I honestly don't know if the mistrust that people have in government in Puerto Rico can get any worse. I think, if you know, from anecdotally, from what I've observed in Puerto Rico, it's just cementing that mistrust in government, and especially in the Department of Health, which obviously is one of the public agencies that where science is very visible and has been very visible during the pandemic. I think that's a great question, and I think that's something that perhaps Carrie can could look into in the future. But from my experience, I wonder, does it get any worse, or can it get any worse? But one of the things that I personally think about from my perspective, as a public scholar and as a representative of a nonprofit organization, is when it comes to trust in science and in public institutions, while the Department of Health in Puerto Rico has very little, and the government in general has very little, I have a lot of trust. Like people look for what scientists have to say, and we've seen that people trust scientists. And so as a member of the community, I see there is an opportunity for me to address some of that mistrust, to address some of the needs that communities have to hear about science and how they can use that science to protect themselves from COVID-19. And so I think there are a lot of challenges in that space, but I think about what are the opportunities for me as a community member and as a representative of a nonprofit organization that has trust to then address the needs of the community.
Thank you. That is a great answer. If any of our other panelists would like to chime in, please feel free to add to this response. But I wanted to keep up with this topic of public trust and social justice, and ask AJ, as you have begun a collaboration with the University of Illinois Healthcare's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, how can you see, or what do you think scientists can do to strengthen social justice through science communication? And how can scientists encourage public engagement in scientists? And could you give an example of ways you have seen scientists engage in meaningful outreach to underrepresented communities?
Great question. There's a lot there. I'll keep to 3 bullet points. So the first one is kind of what I was talking about at the end. It starts at K through 12. If you can make an outreach effort to K through 12s, making maybe even a Saturday morning science where it's an extra enrichment program that everyone has access to. And then there's a equal output. So meaning there's 50 slots for all minority students from diverse backgrounds. Then there's 50 slots of people that are 25 of women, and then 25 of the majority of men. And then we just work all together, and we have a great time to actually foster good science in the context of K through 12 outreach. And if every school could do that, if a teacher for one Saturday out of the month, especially now that we have e-learning access, could invite one scientist across the country to come and actually speak about their science and participate in one activity where they ship the supplies 1 week in advance, or the organs and stuff in advance for them to examine, then we could actually do a lot of greater good, because the K through 12 program can actually tell their individual parents or their multiple parents how they behaved, how they performed in the class, and what they got out of it. And then actually fostering that relationship at the home to actually talk about science allows for individuals to start reading about science so that there's communal engagement at multiple levels. That's the first point. The second point is what we can do personally ourselves. More about educating ourselves is the key. There's a lot of times where we have misrepresentation of different individuals from different groups because we're so assured that the stereotypes or the stereotype threat theory that we see is so right, but as most of the time it's very wrong. For example, I'm supposedly, an award-winning scientist, but when I'm in my daily life, I don't necessarily wear a bow tie or a nice sweater all the time, or a suit. And most of the time people, perceive me as someone that's a thug, but I have a PhD from a very high-ranked institution, and then I have a faculty position at a high-ranked institution that even has a really nice world ranking. But you would never know that, right? So that means that we have to break down these boundaries and these barriers that we have in our minds, and all of us do. We all have implicit bias. So maybe playing the video game that's associated with implicit bias is a good start, and taking the Harvard-approved implicit bias training tests online to see where you fall. Then the third point is asking yourself, have we all done enough? Science engagement is hard, but if we actually admit that we don't know sometimes, that's okay. So we have to question what we know and admit that we don't know. So that means taking a step back into the past and forcing us to actually push forward from the information that we know that is not correct and restructuring it to be correct.
Thank you for that. And actually the point that you brought out about education ties into one of the questions that we got from the public. And I was wondering, Carrie, if you could maybe tell us, what do you think the role of education in improving trust in science is, in terms of increasing the understanding of the nature of science, and then increasing the understanding of the uncertainty there is around science, and what can educators do to help students trust the scientific process, but also to think critically about these issues. I guess a real life example that we have right now is, as the pandemic unfolds, there's new information that needs to be understood. The health guidelines are changing constantly to adapt to new research, and sometimes this can be seen as mixed messaging from scientists. So is there a better way of scientists to communicate in instances like this?
Yeah, I mean, this is really hard. It's been an opportunity for science in a certain way because it is at center stage. We have seen scientists in the spotlight around the world in a way we really, I don't think, have ever seen before, certainly not in the past few decades. And I would say, in addition to that, you see there is a kind of collective learning. Not every single person knows everything. I certainly don't. But overall, the boat has lifted up a little in terms of our understanding of what this disease is, of what public health does to try to mitigate or control infectious diseases, of a lot about the scientific process. All this conversation around developing a vaccine has exposed a conversation about how the scientific process works that hasn't been there before. So there's a lot going on that can be a good opportunity for science as well. But at the same time, I am, trust is complicated, and it's not something you just measure it and you're done with it. I think it is much better to think of it as a relationship, just like any other relationship needs feeding and nurturing all the time. And, whatever your role is in this, you're looking to see, what am I doing that could help support, right? That could help support the cause, that could help alleviate fears or strengthen relationships between with science. Let's put it that way. Because on the downside, I just wanted to come back to something Monica had said, which has resonated and has been so common about people's past experiences, not always as an individual, but they know about these cases of mistreatment, and that leads to a kind of a climate of perhaps appropriate caution and worry that they will be taken advantage of and maybe even badly harmed. And so, I don't know, I'm losing track, but I just wanted to come back to that because that's so important. And I guess the point is that trust is multidimensional. There's like a general sense of, sure, I trust scientists, but you're also seeing at the same time this conversation about, can I trust scientists to give me a safe treatment, to treat me fairly in the medical care system, all those kinds of things. So let me leave it at that.
You just need to read the book, Medical Apartheid in the Classroom, to actually open everyone's eyes to the past so that we can move forward and learn about what actually has happened and actually understand what is the right ethical practice for all of us to approach science. And then if human subjects have to be used, what are the real guidelines so that multiple publics, I really like that, can be able to actually be exposed to that and know. And then the next thing I believe that we could do is actually opening our eyes in the context of realizing it takes time for science. Science is not like baking a cake. You know, even sometimes with cakes, there's failure. You know, some cakes are beautiful, some cakes are lopsided, some don't, you know, rise at all. So we have to realize that's just what science is. We may have these nice PhDs or MDs or multiple degrees, but doesn't mean anything in the context of time. We don't control time. That's something that's outside of our ability. So information changes as discoveries happen. And that's what science is. Usually a pill that you take like Tylenol, although it was a blockbuster drug, took a very long time to make. And it actually took vetted information over and over, reproducing it in multiple models to be able to get it on the shelf today. So that's what's happening now with this vaccine. And I say this vaccine because we don't know which one right now will actually make the cut. So just stay tuned and have patience.
Looks like Moel is frozen. Um, so I'm actually just gonna jump in. There are a few questions that I see on the Q&A that I wanted to address, and it's about, you know, how do you build trust with a community that's not your own? You know, if you have to work in a community where you know, you come from a majority identity and you're going and working with a marginalized identity, how do you approach that? You know, first of all, I think the awareness of the privileges that you have is something that's really, really important. You know, I think one of the things that I think a lot about is trusted messengers and meaningful partnerships with members of those communities. You know, one of the projects that I'm leading in Puerto Rico is the creation of this collection, or like this information kit about COVID-19. And we really want this to not just reach marginalized communities in Puerto Rico, but be owned by marginalized communities in Puerto Rico. You know, we're providing this like ready to use scientific information so that they can go out into their communities and use it as they see fit. And one of the ways that we've been approaching that is we've been reaching out to community leaders. You know, like I grew up in a rural community in Puerto Rico, but it's been almost 20 years since I've lived there. And so I know that I don't know what it's like to live their lives. So what I've done is I've reached out to these community leaders and said, you know, I want to do this in partnership with you. Here is the expertise that I have. Here are the things that I don't know. I recognize that as a community leader and your community, nobody knows better what you need than you. Also, I recognize that you have science knowledge. You might not call it science, others might not call it science, but it is science knowledge fundamentally. And so that recognition, that valuing of people's experience, that understanding of where they're coming from. People are tired, people are afraid, there's a lot of uncertainty. Some people don't know what they're gonna eat tonight. And so knowing all of those things is really, really important, and then creating that meaningful partnership. And so I would say, identify who those leaders are in the community that are trusted messengers and that can help you broker those relationships. You know, come in with the understanding that the deficit model should be dead. It's not dead, but this idea of there's a lack of information, and if I just give people information, problems will be fixed. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We keep using it. So remember, the deficit model should be dead. It's not yet, but it should be dead. And so, you know, come in with genuinely saying, I have this expertise and I want to put it in your service. How do we do this? And then ask genuine questions. You know, with this listening session, we came in and we said, we want to do these things. You know, our first campaign, we want to give you tools to celebrate Christmas safely, because Christmas is a huge deal in Puerto Rico. It's a huge part of our identity. It's a huge part of our culture. People will get together. It's not a question of if, it's like a matter of how do we do it safely. And so we said, what are the things that you want to know? And how do I help you get that information? So, it's really about meaningful partnerships and honesty and being genuine, also recognizing that you might mess up. And that's okay. If you do, apologize and don't expect people to educate you. Educate yourself.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. This has been a great conversation. I'm pretty sure that everyone here in the session enjoyed it as much as we all did. Thank you so much to our 3 panelists, and we will try our hardest to get the question and get answered and share with all of the members. And we'll keep with our session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.